Oscar Piastri takes home another win to take the lead of the Drivers' Championship by 10 points over his teammate Lando Norris. An impressive win by Piastri, but it came with some controversy. Max Verstappen takes a 5-second penalty at the beginning of the race, which takes him out of the lead, but was it warranted? And would Max have won this race without it? And Ferrari finally breaks through with their first podium of the season. Was this a lucky result, or is it a sign of better days for the Scuderia? We dive into all of it and everything else we saw during the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. Oscar Piastri finds himself back on the top step of the podium for the third time in 5 races this season. And on top of that, he becomes the first Australian to lead the Drivers' Championship since his manager Mark Webber in 2010. This wasn't an easy victory for Oscar, though. It all started with lap 1, of course. Oscar and Max start on the front row and go into turn 1 side by side. Max goes off track but stays ahead of Oscar, and the stewards end up giving Max a 5-second penalty for passing off track. Now, there's been a lot of debate on this decision from the stewards. Personally, I think it was the right one. Oscar was clearly ahead at the apex of turn 1, so it was his corner, and honestly, it didn't look like Max really tried to make that corner. It looked like he let off the brakes so he could stay ahead and pull the, well, he pushed me off argument. I'm glad someone finally did this to Max. This is the same type of move we've seen him pull so many times on other drivers, which, honestly, made all of his complaining after the race a little ridiculous and hypocritical. But once Max got that penalty, it became clear to Oscar that he just needed to manage that first stint and stay close enough to Max so he came out ahead after the pit stops. It was a little hard for him in the dirty air, and Oscar did say after the race he overheated his tires trying to stay close to Max in the first part of the race, which explains why he was dropping back a little bit right before his pit stop. But he did enough to get ahead of Max after Max came into the pits and served that 5-second penalty. Surprisingly, though, it started to get a little closer than expected at the end. At one point, I think Oscar had a 5-second lead after the pit stops, but Max took that down to 2.8 seconds at the end of the race. Now, a few things went into this. Oscar didn't lose much during this moment, but he did start to get a little bit of Lando's dirty air before Lando came into the pits around lap 34, which did slow Oscar down a little bit. There are also a number of back markers to navigate around towards the end of the race, which Max did have to navigate around too, but it looks like Oscar had a little more of that. But Max did have a little bit of a tire advantage over Oscar because of Max's later pit stop, which of course helped him at the end. But Oscar Piastri takes the checkered flag for another convincing win, which puts him first in the driver's standings for the first time in his career. Oscar's building a lot of momentum. We still have 19 races to go. It's certainly not over, and I'm sure Lando and even Max will have a say in this championship fight as the season goes on. But 2 poles and 3 wins in 5 races for Oscar now. Max might be the most talented driver on the grid. That seems to be unanimous. But Oscar looks like the strongest at this stage of the season. And his ability to handle pressure and stay calm and collected will be invaluable as the season goes on and this title fight heats up. I mean, really, when you look at Oscar compared to the other drivers, he's without a doubt the most level-headed. He never gets too high. He never gets too low. And can we take a minute and talk about that insane pass that he pulled on Lewis? We never see passes at that part of the track in Jeddah. I mean, literally going into the trickiest corner of the track. And this was the second pass this season from Oscar, ironically both on Lewis, that just made your jaw drop. And Oscar needed to make that happen too. He already came into the pits to put on the hard tires, but he was stuck behind Lewis while Max was still out in front in clean air trying to build up that time before he came into the pits. But it's these kinds of moves, they're a big reason why Oscar's the favorite for the Drivers' Championship now. Sure, he's fast and he's in the best car, but he is so gutsy and bold when it comes to wheel-to-wheel racing. And it's a trait that only the all-time great drivers have. Now, Max takes home P2, and he was pretty upset after the race at the steward's decision to give him that 5-second penalty. So would Max have won the race if he didn't get that penalty? Like I said before, he only finished 2.8 seconds behind Oscar, and it looked like he had the fastest car on track at certain points. So on paper, it's easy to think, well, yeah, take that penalty away and it puts him ahead of Oscar by 2.2 seconds. Easy math. Not exactly. One, Max deserved that penalty. So the only scenario that works for this exercise is if Max gave up that corner to Oscar and slotted into second after the first few turns. This would have put Max into Oscar's dirty air, and he would have struggled a lot more with his pace and managing his tires. If the race played out this way, there's really only two scenarios where Max could have gotten back ahead of Oscar. The first being after the safety car, if Oscar botched the restart and Max got a good run on him going into turn one. The other is if Max came into the pits early, caught McLaren and Oscar by surprise, and undercut Oscar. But he would have had to have been about 1.5 seconds behind Oscar to make that work, maybe 2.5 if Oscar has that bad pit stop like we saw during the race. But both of those situations would probably be pretty unlikely. We would have seen much better pace from Oscar out front in clean air, and he wouldn't have overheated his tires in that first stint, being in that clean air. But regardless, P2 is a very impressive result from Max. This Red Bull car looks stronger than it did at the beginning of the season. And this was a track that suits their car better than others, but it looks like that engine cover upgrade from a few weeks ago has really solved a lot of their problems. Going to Ferrari, they finally get their first podium. Charles Leclerc finishes P3 with a much needed result for this team, and a lot of this came down to strategy. He stayed out on the medium tires until lap 30, which gave him a tire advantage at the end of the race, but also gave him clean air for those final 8 or 9 laps of the first stint, which was huge for his race. But the car was also just quick around this track, and it was really promising to see for this team after a disappointing qualifying. Maybe the new floor is somewhat working, like the team expected, but on the flip side, even with that podium, Leclerc was still 11 seconds off the lead, so there's still more room for improvement for this team. And not to rain on Ferrari's parade, but you can thank Lando's qualifying crash for that podium. And look, I'm not trying to say it's a fake podium or really discredit it in any way. Luck plays a huge role in race results from time to time, and we've seen that almost with every driver. But I'm more so bringing up the point just to help manage expectations as to whether Ferrari has figured out their problems and is ready to be competitive again. But P3 for Leclerc is a good day for him. His teammate, though, another disappointing result. It's concerning how much of a difference we're still seeing between these two Ferrari drivers, and I feel like a broken record coming on here every week and saying that, but Lewis finished this race 30 seconds behind Leclerc. That's a huge difference in performance. But even more concerning is Lewis's negative outlook on the whole situation. And you understand it being tough for arguably the greatest driver in sports history to possibly come to grips with the idea that maybe he just doesn't have it anymore. But we're getting those same sad, hopeless interviews again from Lewis where he's telling the press, don't expect anything better. There's nothing I can do. There's nothing the team can do. It's going to be a long, painful season. It's not the type of stuff that's going to be encouraging for the team and motivate them to turn this around. There's a lot of frustration built up on that side of the garage, and a negative outlook from the driver isn't going to help anything. All right, a few thoughts on the other McLaren driver, Lando Norris. Obviously a bad Saturday for him with the qualifying crash, but a much better Sunday. He makes up 6 places during the race and almost makes it to the podium, but ends up finishing P4. Now, a podium would have been better, but still a good recovery drive from Lando. Of course, he got lucky with that lap 1 crash between Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda right in front of him that took them out of the picture right away. But Lando worked his way up the order pretty easily. Fortunately for us, we got a little bit of excitement with that, with his battle with Lewis and the two drivers playing some mental games with each other with the DRS. But this result was probably the most Lando could have gotten out of this race starting all the way back in 10th. At the end, it looked like he had a chance at catching Leclerc in 3rd, but I don't think this was ever realistic with the dirty air and just how fast Leclerc was, especially at the end of the race. P4 was a good result for Lando after that crash, but there was still more left on the table for him this weekend, and that's probably going to sting for a little bit. Without that crash, there's a good chance we would have been looking at a Lando win if he was able to get pole. If not a win, at least P2 or P3. I think for Lando's own confidence to really keep this championship fight going, he desperately needs a strong weekend and probably a race win in Miami. Now, of course, this is the track where he took his first career win last year, but McLaren should be a little more dominant at that track with the warmer temperatures and with it being a daytime race. The week off will probably do Lando some favors too, and give him some time to reset and come back ready for a bounce back performance. Going to Mercedes, a surprisingly bad race for them. George Russell finishes P5 and Kimi Antonelli finishes P6, which doesn't look terrible on paper, but they finished 27 and 34 seconds off the lead respectively. Their tires just did not work in this race. Both drivers overheated the medium tires on the first stint, which forced them to come in early. Not that much earlier than others, but enough to really hurt them at the end of the race because of that tire offset. But Mercedes had to have made a wrong turn with the setup of their two cars, because even with that tire offset, it doesn't explain their tires completely falling off a cliff like they did. I mean, George was losing a second a lap to the leaders at the end at one point, and it sounded like he wasn't even going to make it to the end of the race on his tires. A pretty big step back for a team that looked like it was on the verge of competing with the McLarens and Max at the top. Going to Williams, double points finish for them, thanks to some good teamwork. P8 for Carlos Sainz, P9 for Alex Albon. Carlos's best finish with Williams, but a lot of credit goes to him for Albon's P9. Around lap 36, Isaac Hadjar in the Racing Bull, who opted for the reverse strategy, starting the race on hards and switching on to mediums later in the race, started closing in on Alex Albon in ninth. But knowing their pace and knowing how hard it was to pass at this track, Sainz drops back to give Albon his DRS, and that's enough to keep Hadjar behind the rest of the race. And this was something Williams prepared for before the race too, albeit to defend against Pierre Gasly and not Isaac Hadjar, but it all ended up working out the same. But to make this work, they needed Albon to back off in certain parts of the track to cool down his tires so he could get back close enough to Sainz coming out of turn 27 going into the long straight. So a lot of credit goes to Alex Albon too for managing that situation over the last 15 laps. But this result puts Williams back into fifth in the constructors' standings. And again, we have a long way to go in this season, but it looks like we have a pretty good battle brewing between Williams and Haas for that fifth position in the constructors. Some other quick notes on the rest of the grid. I mentioned it just a second ago, but Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda crash out on lap 1. Both drivers are out of the race at that point. Looking back at the footage, I don't think you can say it's really either driver's fault and more of a lap 1 incident. Tough for both drivers, though. Both were looking pretty strong all weekend and looked like they were headed for points finishes in this race. Of course, for Yuki, it hurts a little more because he's in the better car and the expectations the team has for the second Red Bull seat are so great. Hopefully, though, Miami's a new weekend and we can see a bounce-back performance, at least from Yuki, but possibly even Pierre too. Sticking with the Red Bull family, another good P10 result for Isaac Hadjar. He was one of the drivers who started the race on hard tires, which actually looks like it was the better strategy coming out of the race. Probably could have gotten P8 or P9 if it wasn't for the Williams teamwork, but still another good result for the rookie. More misfortune for his teammate Liam Lawson, though. He gets a 10-second penalty at the end of the race for gaining an advantage off track, which pushes him back to P12. Honestly, looking at the footage, probably one of the most ridiculous penalties I've ever seen. Lawson passed Jack Doohan as they're crossing the start-finish line and completed the pass well before the first corner. But he goes a little bit too long into the first corner, goes off track a little bit, and I guess the argument for the stewards is that Doohan was right behind him, so going long into that corner allowed him to stay ahead, but still just an absurd decision. And unfortunate for Liam too, because he was having a good race. He was behind his teammate, but a lot of that did come down to strategy. So not the worst result for him, but that penalty is going to sting a little bit. A bad race for Haas. It started in qualifying, but they just struggled around this track. They did take a risk with strategy, and it just didn't pay off. Of course, the safety car comes out after that lap 1 crash, and Haas brings in both drivers to put on the hard tires and hopefully make it to the end, which they did, but that made them just lose so much time that it wasn't even worth it. So, bad strategy call from Haas, but even without that, I don't know if they really would have done so much in this race. Another poor performance from Jack Doohan, which probably puts his Alpine future back into doubt. He finishes P17, and part of that was due to the risk the team took bringing him into the pits during that early safety car. That ended up turning his race into a 2-stop because his tires just couldn't make it. But it was just an unimpressive performance, and he can't afford unimpressive performances with Franco Colapinto waiting in the garage. And here we are, yet again, and reports are coming out that the team doesn't know what to do with the two of them. So here we go again for Jack. I don't really have much to say about Aston Martin and Sauber. I guess for Fernando Alonso, he at least got up to P11 thanks to that Liam Lawson penalty. He almost got taken out of the race too in a pretty hairy moment with Gabriel Bortoleto going into turn 1. Both drivers very fortunate to make it out of that one unscathed, but both of these teams, Aston Martin and Sauber, clearly have their full focus on 2026, and their lack of competitiveness on track definitely shows that. All right, that'll do it for today's episode. A little bit of a quick one. Again, we just didn't get a whole lot of excitement out of this race. We got the fun turn 1 incident between Max and Oscar. We got a lap 1 crash that brought out a safety car. We got a fun battle between Lewis and Lando for a few laps, and an insane pass by Oscar Piastri. But other than that, pretty status quo, and it's just the way it goes sometimes in this sport. We are, of course, off next weekend, and then off to Miami after that. I will be back with a episode previewing the Miami Grand Prix that'll probably come a little earlier in the week because I am going to the Miami Grand Prix. But I will do another episode recapping the Grand Prix and everything we saw that weekend. It will probably come on Monday after I get back from that race weekend, but hopefully we're in for a good one. It'll definitely be a hot one, so hopefully I have some shade out there. But thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.